Great. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Megan Raymond. I direct programs and membership here at WCET. WCET is part of WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission of Higher Education. And we're very pleased today to bring together both the WICHE Commission audience as well as the WCET seminar attendees. So welcome everybody. We have a wonderful, wonderful bonus session, we're calling it. And we're so glad that you could be with us. We know it's a crazy day for many of you, but we appreciate you being part of this essential conversation. Our leader today is Ben Cannon, who is the Executive Director of the Oregon Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and he's also a WICHE Commissioner. I'll go ahead and let Ben take it away. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to your questions as we have time. So take it away, Ben.
Thanks very much, Megan, and thanks everybody for joining today. I'm sure we have your undivided attention for this conversation this afternoon about the value of post-secondary education and what we're doing as systems and states and institutions to communicate and improve the value both to individuals and to communities broadly. So we're going to begin with introductions from our panelists, and I'm going to start by asking Leah, and then followed by Michael and Millie to introduce themselves.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Leah Bornstein. I am the president and CEO of Ames Community College in Colorado. It's about an hour north of Denver, and it's a beautiful, crazy 77-degree day here today. I also wanted to let you know that when I was in Arizona about 5.5 years ago, I had being a WICHE commissioner for 8 years during my time in Arizona. And during that time, I also had the privilege of being the commission's chairperson. So I have a very soft spot in my heart for WICHE, lots of wonderful work that you all do. And I look forward to always receiving those reports that come out and learning what's going on in our region and certainly in higher education across the world, really. So thank you so much for taking some time today and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Michael.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Collins. I'm vice president at an organization called Jobs for the Future, JFF. We're a national nonprofit. We're based in Boston. We have satellite offices in DC and in Oakland. And we work to transform the nation's education and workforce development system so that it works for everyone, particularly the people who are the most vulnerable in our economy. For the last 15 years, I have worked across the country in post-secondary reform, leading JFF's effort in a number of national completion initiatives like Achieving the Dream and Completion by Design and others. And in that time have worked primarily on state and systems level policy. I have not worked with WICHE directly. I am on the NCHEMS board. Millie and I are both on the NCHEMS board. And so, you know, I feel connected to WICHE, and I'm terrific. I'm glad to be here and have this conversation. It's terrific to be with you. Thank you.
Hola, my name is Millie Garcia. I am president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, known as ASCU, that represents approximately 400 state colleges and universities across the country, and former president of 2 of the California State University campuses. Like Michael, I am on the NCHEMS board, and so know a little bit about WICHE, and especially when we have the time to visit in that building, know we are really close by. Great being with this amazing panel.
Thanks to each of you. And as you can see, we've got a great panel, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Before asking Millie to talk about some recent work that she's been doing with the Gates Foundation on the question of valuing post-secondary education, I wanted to provide some sort of framing remarks that might be touch points for some of the conversation to come. And I'm actually going to begin with some just a couple of slides that reflect some Oregon data that I think is also broadly applicable to many other states. And the first slide, and hopefully I'm sharing now, the first slide is a chart that expresses, and many of you have seen slides like this before if you do higher education policy and funding, but it's an expression of the state's, the public's support for post-secondary education in my state, Oregon. Those are the green bars on a per student basis over about the last 20 years. And as you can see, on an inflation-adjusted basis, we're not where we were even 20 years ago. And in spite of pretty significant rises in costs that aren't fully reflected in the inflation adjustment, we're not investing as a public what we were 20 years ago in our students, our post-secondary students. The red line is the national average. So as you can see, we've tracked pretty well with the trends of the national average and begun to close the gap between Oregon funding and the nation as a whole. When it comes to per student investment, Oregon is not a leading state in terms of public funding for post-secondary education. But I think really looking at that red line, looking at these green lines, it helps illustrate the fact that we have not successfully enough made the case to our lawmakers about the value of post-secondary education as a public good and likely as an individual one. And I think that's part of what we're concerned with and want to talk about today, particularly as our states and our country face, in many cases, sort of fiscal contraction that's going to put additional pressures on higher education budgets. This will be the final piece of data that I share, but this is an expression of part of what this public disinvestment has meant for students, and it reflects their increased, the cost shift to students, the increased cost of their post-secondary education that they're bearing. So whereas in 2000, they paid or borrowed for about 41% of the cost, in Oregon, of their post-secondary education. Today, you can see that has increased to 57%, and it is now the case that students are paying or borrowing and paying the majority of their costs of their education. And this doesn't include the non-institutional costs, the costs of books, housing, transportation, living costs, et cetera. So I'm going to stop with the data there and just go on to say that as we think about valuing post-secondary education, I think we're accustomed to thinking about this in a couple of different ways. And perhaps the most familiar one is the value to the individual, right? And we are steeped in our understanding that there is a wage premium associated with post-secondary education, successful completion of post-secondary education. It's a significant wage premium, but that value equation has become perhaps harder to communicate to students and families, that individual value premium, in part because of the increasing costs that students are bearing. So when they do the math, it may not be as evident as it was that there is value to them in that equation. I worry about being in a vicious cycle where public disinvestment leads to rising costs to students, leads to a perception that there isn't value, leads to decreased public investment, right? And I'm worried that we're on that cycle. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm excited about the conversation today and ways that we broaden our conception of value or restore our conception of value to include the public good associated. That yes, there are private benefits and they are significant that accrue to individuals, but there are also significant public good. And I really look forward to hearing our panelists' thoughts about both aspects of those and how they really merge and blend. So with that, by way of introduction, let me turn it over to Millie to talk about her recent work with the Gates Commission report on the value of post-secondary credentials.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you so much for that intro because you're making my work easier as I talk about what is the Gates Value Post-Secondary Education Commission doing. I'm honored to co-chair this commission with Sue Desmond-Hellmann, who's the former CEO of the Gates Foundation. And they've convened a group of national thought leaders, higher ed leaders, business leaders, advocates, students, media, union leaders, and others to come together to talk about this important work. The commission's work is a powerful retort to those who question, just like what Ben was saying, the value of higher education. Is higher education still worth the investment today? And as Ben said, sadly, we have been losing the confidence of the public. And with COVID, it's not making it any easier. Our work focuses on clearly demonstrating the economic and non-economics of pursuing post-secondary education after high school. We know it's absolutely essential that we are clearly quantifying and articulating the long-term lifetime value of higher education as Ben said, not only for the individual, but for the state, the communities, the country as a whole. You know, we still have that age-old argument that higher ed is a private good versus a public good. It's both and we have to make sure that we move away from that limited view that and to expand it to how earning a college degree can change the impact for the families of the student, but for the country. You know, we've seen that a child born into the bottom 20% income level is 3 times more likely to reach the top 40% income level if they get education after high school. What the Post-Secondary Value Commission is aiming to do is to successfully fuel a movement focused on equitable value, especially in the current context, by first defining value in a way that reflects things like employment, earnings, ability to repay debt, upward movement on the income ladder, and acknowledge the non-economic benefits of education like critical thinking skills, improved health, greater likelihood to vote and volunteer, greater likelihood to become leaders in your communities, etc. And also by measuring value, using consistent and reliable data to show outcomes for different types of students in different types of programs, especially for low income, first generation, and students of color. It also means using information about value to generate pressure and demand for the value of post-secondary programs. And then we have to take these definitions and articulate them not only to presidents and chancellors, faculty, and staff, but of course, students and their families, and also communicate the value of higher education more broadly. I think this audience can agree with me. We haven't done a very good job with that. Our colleges and universities have to ensure that we're not preaching to the choir, that we're not just talking to ourselves, that we have to take the return on investment on the story of an education after high school out into the communities in their language and in their space. Communities are different. They speak different languages. We have to connect with those communities. And we need to expand the conversation about the reasons and change the narrative about the reasons why you should go to college rather than concentrating on what you're not getting when you go to college. And we have to be very clear about that and underscore again that institutions are stewards also of place. They're parts of communities. And that if those institutions move from some of those communities, that community will die because they are the social, economic, and social hub and cultural hub of those communities. So like everything else, what we were hoping for was to unveil all the new results in October. But COVID had different plans, like it's done with everything else, and delayed those early findings. But let me share a couple of the very preliminary findings that were just shared at ASCU's annual conference just a week ago. And one of them is that the majority of public and private nonprofit institutions provide a minimum economic return to students within 10 years of entry, though most for-profits do not. Also, in almost every sector, median student earnings are below median associate or bachelor degree earnings in their state 10 years after initial enrollment. And in one public university system used to test the value framework, there are fields, more than others, there are far wider gaps in earning outcome by race, income, and gender in some fields than others. Yet all fields can offer completers, and I'm underscoring completers, a path to economic mobility. Completion is instrumental to diminishing earnings gaps by race, income, and gender. And the last thing I'd like to share is that, there is this emerging new majority in our country, and it's a tragedy that just as more of the new majority is entering the diverse student body that I call the first gen, the low income, the students of color or students of color are entering higher ed, they're finding themselves hit by COVID-19 and also by the disinvestment because states don't have the dollars anymore. So our schools must take a hard look at what steps they're taking to ensure the success of all students, especially the low income, the Black and Latinx students. What options are available to support them now? And the goal, again, of the commission is to provide useful information, a way of understanding that information, to help colleges and universities, policymakers, and students with the decisions they have to make about pursuing and providing education after high school, because it is one of the most consequential investments that we are making as for society as well as an individual. This is personal to me. I'm a first generation college student, Puerto Rican family, and saw what difference it has made to my family and my community. Thanks.
Thanks, Millie. That's terrific. Appreciate the report. And Michael and Leah, I wonder you'd share any reactions, things that resonated, things that you want to expand or deepen in the conversation to come. Michael, I'll start with you and then Leah.
Well, I guess I just thought to start off by saying I think the conversation around value is it's welcome. I think it's long overdue. I think in this country there has been, I think actually there is what I call a college mobility narrative. Kind of you go to college, you get a job, and everything is great, and that is not accurate. And we know that there is vast kind of difference in earnings depending on the type of credential. And now that we have the earnings data and we're able to attach earnings data to majors, we're seeing that all degrees are not equal, and we're also seeing the concentration of students of color in credentials that lead to low-wage work, right? And this is highly problematic. It certainly contributes to the lack of confidence, right, that we see in credentials. That contributes to the debate around the value of credentials. So I think this conversation is welcome. It's timely. I think that there is quite a bit of work that has to be done to disrupt some of the patterns that we see with who in this country earns a credential of value, and the concentration of kind of upper income white students in our nation's more selective institutions, and the concentration of our students of color and lower income students in open access non-selective institutions that receive far fewer resources is a problem of national compelling interest, and I think that this conversation just could not be more timely.
Thanks, Michael. Leah?
Thank you. Certainly, this pandemic has framed a lot of initiatives and thoughts on how to move forward. And so certainly when we think about colleges and universities, historically, they have been leaders in their communities. They have been conveners of conversations for problem solving. So how do we as higher ed professionals and supporters of higher ed really look to recovery? How do we help recovery and moving forward, which of course is, in my mind, certainly a public good. How do we all think together to move forward in what I prefer next reality as opposed to new normal, but in this next reality. So when we're looking at public good, it's certainly an opportunity for us to be very key members in our, not only our local communities, but our regional, statewide, and national and global communities to have a conversation of what does this really mean? What do we look like? What's different as we recover and as we, come out the other side, if you will. So what does that mean for us? So we, I think, have a great opportunity to be a large part of the solution in recovery and thereby certainly showing value, certainly to the public on how we interact.
Thanks. I want to stick with this notion of the economic return to the individual, which of course benefits communities. So I'm not trying to sever the two sides there, but stick with that for a moment. And some of the issues that Michael raised related to equity, related to the concentration of students of color, for example, low-income students in credentials and programs that may not, now that we have better increasing levels of earnings data, access to earnings data may not generate the type of return, if you will, that more affluent and whiter students are receiving. I wonder, Millie or Leah or Michael, sort of what you, your organizations, how you're thinking about that, what you may be doing to try to sort of disrupt those trajectories.
I will start by saying that our institutions, and we've been talking about this with ASCU institutions in particular, who serve a large majority of the low-income first-gen students of color, that we have to start doing a much better job of opening up the possibilities to students to know what is out there. Students don't really know, besides doctor, dentist, lawyer, what do you do with these degrees? What are the possibilities of being in STEM? What does that mean? How do I get there? If you're coming from a first generation family and you're surrounded by a community that doesn't have those options, you don't know what those options are. That's the very first thing. And you have to give students an opportunity to engage in that. You also have to talk to families. Families make a big decision, especially in some of the low-income families that I've worked with, especially Latinos, where you have to kind of discuss what are the options that are different. So they're not pushing to get that doctor in the family, a medical doctor in the family, but understand the wonderful opportunities and then provide those experiences, even virtually, of what that means to be in these different opportunities. We know, for example, that we are preparing students for jobs we don't even know. But what is it that they need to know now? The critical thinking, the adaptability, the entrepreneurship, giving students those opportunities to engage in that at our campuses.
I'll go ahead and jump in and echo what Millie was just saying. Certainly the boots on the ground, that's what, at the community college level, that's exactly what we see is how do you engage the family, not only in the conversation about the decision making, but also perhaps even in the education itself. So in one room, if the student, if you will, is taking their class, is there another room where kids could be hanging out together in sort of a daycare capacity? In another room, maybe grandparents are there together, having a different conversation or even watching the kids. So how does the institution then become, the community center, if you will, while the education is occurring, and can it occur intergenerationally?
I think that, part of the challenge here is that I agree with Millie around the, maybe the lack of knowledge and information about the multiplicity of post-secondary, options. I mean, that's certainly a factor, in differences in income with regard to social capital and, connections to employers or to experiences that will, kind of increase the probability, of successful employment. At the same time, I think that part of the challenge around value also is that historically, I believe, higher education, we focus so much on the supply side, right? And what colleges are producing. And I think that with economic disruptions like COVID, there's this collision, and the supply side and what we're producing hits what the labor market needs. And that shifted so dramatically with COVID. And so I think that, as Leah talked about kind of the next reality, getting at value, I think, is going to be really different than how we've historically thought about it, right? Because we have historically thought you go to college, you kind of, you graduate, then you work, and that's not a reality anymore, right? We went from, full employment to high unemployment. And so now people who might have been on tracks to, credentials of value are unemployed, and they may have to avail themselves of some kind of short-term, kind of skilling opportunity, right? And how is that short-term skilling opportunity connected to some of the longer-term, right, credentials that we know that they need to be in to have value over a working life? So I think that, the conversation around value is, it's a complex conversation, and it's changing. And I absolutely agree with Millie and Leah that, COVID and this new reality, it's really forcing us to think about value in, I think, very different ways. And I think it's going to force even greater kind of integration between kind of post-secondary and kind of workforce or kind of, labor market and employers. And I don't mean that to, reduce post-secondary to a job, right? But I think that we are really facing just such dynamism in the economy, such that it's really hard to predict, kind of which credentials are going to line up with what, right? COVID is the perfect example of that.
Michael, if I could just follow up briefly with you on that, where would you or how would you recommend that institutional leaders try to take their cues around that value question related to credentials, related to certificates? I mean, we're so accustomed, I think, to thinking about it in a traditional way, right? A graduate degree probably confers more value than a bachelor's degree, than an associate's degree. And I think, as you're suggesting, both because of COVID and other underlying changes in the nature of work and how employers are looking at post-secondary education, we're in a more turbulent time where there may not be as much of a guarantee around that bachelor's degree, that traditional bachelor's degree, maybe depending on the field, and who knows, maybe depending on the region of the country. Do you have, where would you take cues or encourage us to be taking cues in the design, development, support, funding of programs?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I'll answer it just to be a little provocative, but I definitely defer to Leah and Millie, who are running institutions and have run institutions. In all honesty, I worked at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. I was an assistant commissioner there and assistant to the commissioner for many years, Don Brown, and so have done kind of the state level policy piece, and then working kind of across the country in reform in kind of the think tank world, philanthropy, and working with intermediary organizations. So it's one thing for me to talk about what I think needs to happen, and Leah's sitting there running an institution, and Millie has run institutions, so I want to just kind of preface that. The one thing I'll say, to be a little provocative, is that one of the things that I am observing as I kind of work across the country on completion reform is that there is a, I don't want to call them an army, but there are a lot of kind of social entrepreneurs, employers, technology organizations that want access to the higher education space, and they are just swarming, right? And some of their strategies, I think, warrant institutions to take a look at them. So I think that I worry about, people who are most vulnerable in our economy and need post-secondary to advance, kind of the communities that Millie is describing. And I worry that traditional higher education is not moving fast enough to, accommodate kind of some of the changes that we've seen in the economy. At the same time, I worry that those social entrepreneurs and technology, kind of organizations are not designing for these populations, right? They're not the modal part of, the design. So it's almost like the people who are most vulnerable are caught in between kind of our traditional systems and the new systems. So I would encourage institutional leaders to really think about, the importance of the current systems and structures we've invested in our institutions, right? And how we need to transform them, and also how we need to make sense of, collaborate with, partner with as appropriate, acquire even, potentially, right? Some of these technology-enabled models, right, that can maybe help us scale or help us reach more students. But having mansplained that, I will be quiet now for Leah, and Millie, the real experts on this topic, to tell you the actual truth.
Well, I don't know if it's the actual truth, but Michael, I think you're right on. So the way I view it and what the conversations we're having at Ames is, if we think over the last 7 months, right, out of necessity, we have all been pushed toward, the Internet of Things, and in a much more significant way, right? So pre-COVID, if you will, we may have had our groceries delivered. We may have had them mail delivered, Home Chef and so if you look at your own behavior, our behavior has changed significantly in these last 7 months, where I haven't been to a grocery store. I've had my groceries delivered to the door for more often than not. We haven't been to restaurants very often. If we have, it's been from the restaurant, DoorDash kind of thing, to the car. Think about your medicine. All of my doctor appointments have been telemedicine. We, as far as our higher educational institutions, went remote, whether that means web conferencing like we're doing now, or online, or another form. So really, as Michael was saying, what does that mean for higher ed? And is there an opportunity here for us to think about the services and the classes that we offer traditionally in person? We've gone online, or we've gone remote with some of those. What are some of the advantages of having those services or courses remote, and what do we need to keep? What do we need to continue as we move forward? And that could be, again, a large part of the solution to our recovery, and again, our value to the public good as well as the private good. So we're having those conversations around, I could talk about this for a long time, but I'll give a little teaser like Michael did. We're having conversations around personalization versus customization. What's the difference, and what do those mean? And I'll leave you with that because I'll pick up on that later.
Millie?
I agree with both Michael and Leah. And there's two things that, as I listen to this conversation, I agree wholeheartedly that higher ed has to re-examine and reestablish themselves in very different ways. And think about, what is it that someone who goes to your institution has to know? And talking about COVID, it's the adaptability, teaching how you become adaptable in times of crisis. How do you become flexible in the times of crisis? Critical thinking, entrepreneurship. Look at who's coming out of COVID doing well, being entrepreneurs, working collaboratively through technology with difference globally. And how do you do that? And how do we, and then how do we educate people that this is a necessity? Because we're not used to that. We're used to having a degree in psychology or business or technology or in science, but that these skills of technological skills, working in difference, adaptability, being able to be flexible, being able to be an entrepreneur is going to be critical. We're in the middle of that. But as we move to technology, my worry is the most vulnerable. Those students who we don't know if they're really learning. They are in rooms with people in the background making noise. They don't have a place, many don't have a place to study, may not even have a hotspot, and have to be sitting outside of McDonald's to have that hotspot. And so the very new majority that we're rushing off because of this crisis, I'm afraid we are leaving behind a generation of the new majority. And how does our institutions deal with that?
Thanks. And I noticed we've got at least one, maybe now a couple of questions that we're gonna get to. We'll have at least 10 or 15 minutes, and I may get to them sooner than that. So keep those coming. Millie, sort of following up on your comment about the concern that we have students today whom we don't actually know. I mean, they're enrolled, right? And they're perhaps at a screen, but we aren't necessarily confident that technology is providing meaningfully impacting their learning, growing experience. I mean, it causes me to wonder, so much of the focus of post-secondary education and thinking about value and sort of returns to individual and community is associated with that certificate, with that degree. And we, I think we understand that much of that is imparted to an employer, right? It's a signaling device. Are we doing a good enough job at measuring the actual, apart from the value that a certificate or degree provides as a piece of paper that can be shown to an employer, are we doing enough to measure the actual impact on human lives, right? In terms of knowledge, skills, habits, understandings, right? And is that part of the answer here? Is doing more than saying, you earned a degree, great, go off and earn money. So I think you.
Absolutely, Ben. I am a firm believer that we have to do a better job in trying to understand what is that learning that the student is capturing in this new environment. Because quite frankly, let's face it, many of our institutions were not doing online learning at the rate that we're doing now. Some faculty members prefer not to. Some faculty members don't know how. And so we have to really look at how we're delivering, how we're supporting, tutoring, advising, support services for these students. Are they really connecting? And then how are we measuring that learning besides that piece of paper that you got the degree? Because when you go out to work, or you go out to this new career, or you go on to graduate school, that piece of paper has to demonstrate something.
Anybody else have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I worry that, I would argue that higher education struggled kind of with learning outcomes and we're not where we might be. Remembering the, Richard Arum, book, kind of Academically Adrift, where, we're not clear on what students learn. And I think that it is complicated what we're experiencing today because it, we are, as Millie was talking about, it's not just a kind of a credential, but it can also be skills that are attached to that credential or not attached to that credential, right? Like I think there's almost like confusion as skills are unbundled, right, from credentials, and we may have people that are completing credentials only to show up to an employer to be given an assessment, right, for them to demonstrate skills like that they may or may not have. So I do worry a little bit that we are behind in measuring, and I know there's no perfect measurement, right? I'm always worried about any kind of one-shot kind of assessment, but I think there is a risk that if we do not get a handle on whether it's digital skills, human skills, business, enabler skills, as Burning Glass, kind of talks about, if we don't get a handle on their implications vis-a-vis the broader knowledge that we're teaching in some of the longer term credentials, I think that we could be setting people up for vulnerability, right? They might complete a credential and still not be prepared, and I worry about that. I also worry that the skills piece is really being pushed, and it's almost being pushed unbundled from longer-term credentials, right? Like you can go out in a coding boot camp, right, and get a credential and be successful, and I'm not sure the data bears that out. Like, right, like all these different micro credentials are like almost being put on par with some of the more traditional credentials, which I think can confuse the field, right? It gets back to that heterogeneity of earnings outcomes, right? That is so, and the complexity and multiplicity of options, right? And now we're throwing different skills in there. So I think that we really need some coherence, and we need higher education consensus, right, on what matters here. And I think that that's work that still has to be done.
several of you have addressed the kinds of work that institutions can do to better communicate or better deliver this value proposition to students and to communities. I would be remiss if I didn't, and I guess partly for selfish reasons, ask you to reflect on what states can do, through their policy setting, potentially through their funding role. So at the risk of pushing you into a less natural place, I mean, certainly for you, Leah, as a president, but probably one who is thinking like Millie and Michael about what kind of policy levers states or even potentially federal government should be pulling in order to better demonstrate and deliver value.
So I might have the least amount to say here, but just in thinking through this, and I'll focus on budget because financial resources tend to be on everybody's mind. And knowing that states are trying to figure it out, oftentimes states are reserving a pot of money for innovation or transformation initiatives, which actually in this kind of environment and looking to recovery could be quite a good idea. So for those states who are not, that would be my suggestion is, could there be a pot of money for higher ed to really look at transformation innovation as we are recovering, and then certainly permanently institutionalizing that beyond. So whether it's one-time funding or a grant kind of thing over a few years. But that, I think, not only gives institutions the opportunity to pilot things, obviously, which we already have been in some ways, but in a more robust, permanent way. So with regard to budget policymaking, I would suggest that one right off the top of my head.
Thanks. Michael or Millie?
You want to go, Michael? Okay. I would say a couple of things. I think, I'm going to be a little controversial here. I'm going to say that states, especially for state colleges and universities, should look at which are the institutions that are educating that new majority and giving more funding to those because of the equity issue. And giving more with outcomes. I'm not saying not hold them accountable, but to look at that carefully. The other thing I think states can do is to think about federal state policy in financial aid and bringing together the dollars and helping the most vulnerable reach higher education. And so, I think it is about when you look at the most vulnerable, when you see that over 50% of the schools are students of color and low income, that those are the ones that are coming to our institutions, that many of them are not getting the same quality education they must get, but they are entering our institutions, that our state colleges and universities in particular, and those that serve the underserved, need to have the funding to be able to lift that population with the necessary skills and values and support services, and then hold those institutions accountable.
I think some great ideas have been said, and I do love the support for innovation. I think that the equity piece is really important. I guess I would double down on, I think that we have to recognize that the economic disruptions and the future of work is here. We always said it was coming. It's here, and they're going to be other disruptions, right? Like, how can we learn? I don't want to just build back, for COVID. Like, we really have to think about not just kind of first order effects, like second and third order effects, right? Like, if we take this moment to kind of get kind of people into short-term credentials and we're not thinking about kind of some of the longer term, I think that we just set ourselves up for challenges down the road. So I would love, for states to think about, really, I know it's a loose term, but I really think that this is an opportunity to push the lifelong learning conversation, right? Like, how do we help people who might have to be right now in what Learning Class, calls a lifeboat job, right? A job that they just can get, right? How is that job, connected to skilling and credential opportunities that could help that person advance to a better job, right? So there is an opportunity to do more articulation and linking of, kind of skills and training opportunities, right, to create a lattice work, right, like a real stackable, pathways. And I think that more can be done there. It will take, partnerships across higher education, partnerships with employers, accreditors probably need to be involved, but I would like to see us begin at, in state to create kind of an infrastructure for lifelong learning that connects shorter term skilling and credentialing opportunities with longer term. Because the fact of the matter is, the people who are most vulnerable in our economy, they are disproportionately in kind of the shorter term programs, right? We want them to have that opportunity. If they need immediate employment and skills training, we want that. But we also want them to have the opportunity to build, right, and to advance. It's not about a job they can get today. It's about subsequent jobs as well. And so this is our opportunity. I mean, we couldn't have had a better signal, right? Like, we're cruising along in February with a 4% or whatever unemployment rate, right? COVID hits, and by April, like we're in double digits, and everything that we were planning for, aligning towards was gone, right? And so how do we take this moment, right, to build that infrastructure so that we are prepared? We are preparing people to, not just be trained for a specific occupation, but going back to what Millie said, making sure that we're building in kind of some of the critical thinking, the adaptability, and those things, right? This is our opportunity, and I think that state can play a very big role.
That's great, Michael. We'd love to work with you on building that infrastructure. It sounds like a great project for any state. Leah, did you want to add on this?
I did, and actually, Michael, you were touching on it, and that's why I was nodding my head so vigorously. Is the other I was thinking the other policy piece that I think is really important was considering in the legislature some policy support encouraging the 2-year and the 4-year partnerships, and what does that look like for the pipeline and so forth. And I'll just bring it down a little bit further. When I was in Arizona, Northern Arizona University and Coconino Community College created this program that was basically a transition. It eliminated transfer altogether, and we called it CCC to NAU. We're now bringing this to Colorado, Ames to UNC, University of Northern Colorado, and encouraging our sister and brother institutions to really look at that, to exactly Michael's point. And then how do we bring K-12 into that pipeline and hook that engine up to the train? So that would be great policy development, again, encouraging, and it could be tied to innovation transformation, and encouraging that. So that would be a great policy, and again, contributing to public good.
In California, they have the Long Beach Promise, which starts in K-12, goes into the Long Beach Community College, and then goes either to Long Beach, CSU Long Beach, or CSU Dominguez Hills, and it's been very successful.
Great. Well, thanks for the inspiration around and ideas around state policy work. I mean, I think we've sort of we're ready to come full circle. We started talking about sort of how we better communicate and demonstrate value, work we can do at an institutional level, work we can do at a state level. Before getting to Q&A, which we will here in a moment, I want to come back around to sort of the communication piece and ask sort of a broad question, because that asks you to identify, if you can, sort of understanding that this challenge is one that's going to require both institutional and systems change, as well as more effective communication. But I'm asking now about the communication side, and how, like, specific things we can be doing at any level, whether that's state, institutional, association, etc., to better communicate, in particular, the public good side of, and I know I'm creating sort of a dichotomy here that isn't real between public and private good, but in particular, to those in our states, in our communities who frankly, based on public opinion research, are really darn skeptical, if not outright cynical or hostile to post-secondary education, and they're being asked, at least when it comes to public investment, they're being asked to help pay for it, right, for other people probably. And so I just think we've really got to wrestle with this, and we've got to have a really strong argument to make about why my neighbors should be helping to invest in my public education.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in there because quite frankly, I think community colleges need to be and are making this argument all the time to our communities, depending upon how we're funded, whether it's a local tax base or if we need to go out for bond issues. So this is what I say and what I know many of our colleagues say to folks who are very skeptical and so forth. And we really look to for community colleges, we really look to our career and technical education, right? Community colleges is where we train our firefighters, where we train our police, where we train our nurses, where we train our EMTs that come to the house when you're having an emergency. So we frame it in a story of, you know, when we have the Colorado fires or we have the fires that are in Oregon or wherever they are, those folks that are coming to protect your area are folks that were trained and educated in a post-secondary institution, right? When you're having pains in your left arm and you're thinking you have a heart attack, that ambulance EMT was trained in a post-secondary institution. When you're being triaged at the hospital, that person. So when you think of how your personal property and personal well-being is being taken care of, wouldn't you want someone who has the best training and the best education possible? And honestly, it's really hard to argue that point when you put it in very personal terms in talking about early childhood education. Don't you want your kids and your grandkids, you know, those kinds of things. So that's how I highlight it for folks who are really skeptical.
I'll follow up. I agree with Leah wholeheartedly. And representing state colleges and universities, we have the same story of nurses and teachers, social workers, etc. But I do believe that we can't do this alone and that we need to bring in partners like the media, partners like our state legislators, partners like our city elected officials. And a very quick example, but it has to be consistent and intentional. Can't be one-shot deal. That once we agree on how we're going to communicate this, we had a program with Univision where the institution I was leading at the time, Dominguez Hills, had 109 partners to talk about the need for higher education in Spanish. Univision put it on their TV program. They put it on their radio program. We've had elected officials, state and local, engaged. We set up the gym like IKEA. So they had everybody spoke Spanish, educated everyone. It was all over the city. And my last year, the first year we expected about 100 people, 1,000 people on a Saturday. We had 5,000. When I left the presidency, we had 40,000 people all hearing this, and they brought in personalities speaking about the importance of higher ed and why and what was the value. We need to do something like that nationwide, and we have to include the media, technology, in order to send out the message to educate individuals.
I think for me, the opportunity it's really transparency. In some ways, the debate around the value of post-secondary, I'm actually sympathetic to it. It is such a wonky, like I do this for a living and it's super confusing, right? Like, so, you know, on average, the data, you know, at the median, like, you know, of lifetime earnings, it's so clear. It's not a debate, right? Like a bachelor's degree, graduate education, like it's going to pay just so much more, right? But the challenge is that that's at the median, right? And so your income, your race, your gender, right? Like your program of study, your institution, all of those variables matter as to whether or not your credential will pay off in the labor market, right? And so transparency around that, and some of it's counterintuitive. I worry that there's so much focus on the STEM fields, right? Because STEM fields are the high probability of employment out of college. But I've seen data, David Demings at Harvard has shown data that 10 years out, half the people who graduate with STEM degrees leave the field. It's very difficult to keep up with all of the changes in science and technology, right? So, and the wage premium 10 years out goes away, right? And liberal arts students actually catch up, so it's like, that is confusing, right? So the public, of course, they are also confused. So I think that our opportunity is transparency and helping the field understand that, like, look, this is a false debate. Post-secondary education is absolutely valuable, right? But we have to be clear about the variables that matter. And that, we have to just update the college mobility narrative, right? It's not a one-shot, deal and everything's great. It's a high-stakes investment, right? And you have to make smart decisions for it to pay off. And I think that that's very different from what we're used to, right? Like in the original college, people weren't going to the original colleges to come out to get a job, right? That wasn't what our hallowed institutions were designed for, right? Today, it's very different. And I think that we have to update that narrative so that there's clarity around you can go and it doesn't have to necessarily pay off, but you can go and it absolutely can pay off. And I think that that's the communications. It's really the clarity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It also brings to mind for me the need to be clearer, and this gets back to institutional and systems change, but clearer about the fact that while higher education certificates and degrees do provide earning significant average earnings boost, they are not delivered equitably, right? That we concentrate, and it goes back to one of your earlier points, Michael, we concentrate our underrepresented students of color, our first generation students, in lower earning degree levels or not college at all, right? And so we're failing to provide this great good, which is high quality post-secondary education equitably, and that that requires a whole bunch of strategies to tackle. Let me turn to some of what's been sent in, and one question here has to do with a sort of specific institutional innovation, if you will, or approach involving credit for prior learning and the possible role that it could play or should play in delivering value to students.
Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to jump in there because that little teaser I dangled earlier about personalization versus customization, this might be a good place to do that. So again, internally at Ames, we're having that conversation about what's the difference. So as we were discussing recovery, what do we want to institutionalize post-pandemic, folks were talking about, well, personalization, we're able to communicate personally to students and so forth. The other thought that was coming out was customization. We've been going remote, whether that's web conferencing or online. We've done hybrid. Some of our CTE classes are in person. What if we, and this isn't a new idea, but it would be stepping in a much bigger way, what would that look like if students get to customize completely their education? Well, we personalize the communication, but they customize their education. So they may say, I want to take this particular course online, but this class I want to take in person. This service I want over here. We've been talking for years about swirling, where students, they take classes at different institutions. Well, this is kind of an internal swirl, if you will, where they customize their own learning. Again, not a new concept, but we probably all as a sector haven't stepped into that in a more significant way, which includes, when you talk about customization, it includes credit for prior learning. Why not at all levels? It includes competency-based education. It includes remote, it includes online, it includes hybrid, it includes all these kinds of wonderful things. And, sometimes we are our own worst enemy and get in the way of that. And so what both Millie and Michael were saying about we need to be having these conversations about how do we continue to be contemporary. Tradition is important, and our outcomes need to be contemporary. So our world changes so quickly. How do we keep up and maybe preferably be a little bit ahead so that we're training, educating folks so that they both have the tradition and they've got that edge up on what's coming. So that would be how I would respond to that question.
We're in the middle of a crisis, and I know that sometimes we're our own worst enemy, but institutions are starting to see that they have to change, especially faculty, in looking at prior learning, in looking at competency, in looking at who's in your backyard, those adults that need to come back. How do we get them back on our institutions to save the institution and that community, but also to help those individuals who have not completed in looking at prior learning and looking at competency. And I do believe we're at a particular point right now where institutions are having real trouble with enrollments, that this is the time to be talking about this.
Thanks. Those are great answers. I'm gonna look at the next one. Speaking of being our own worst enemy, this participant asks about internal barriers to some of the types of transformations that you've described, and would be interested in your thoughts. Leah, I'm sure you are thinking about this every day, right? Because you run a complex organization that may not be fully aligned always with your objectives around transformation. So any thoughts on this?
Yes, lots of them, but we don't have enough time. But I guess in the short term, I would say, how do you shift culture, right? Culture eats strategy for lunch, right? We can have the best strategies, and we all do. We have great strategies. And how do we shift a culture? That's one of the reasons, and I know we've all heard this, is don't let a good crisis go to waste. We've just shown that for at least 7 months, we have been able to move very quickly. And I'm not the first one to say this. I'm sure you've heard this from others too. Had we at Ames, and I'll just own it, had we wanted outside of COVID to move to a much more robust online environment, we would have had years of conversation. We all did it, not just us, but y'all too. We all did it, in 10 days, 2 weeks, boom, turned it around. Services, classes, you name it. Now the CTE programs, they had a tougher time, and we haven't found that silver bullet yet. But that, I think when we talk about our own worst enemy, sometimes, while I said tradition is important, sometimes it gets in the way of, well, we've always done it this way, and this is what higher ed's supposed to be, and this is why I stepped into this. Well, the world's changing right around us, and it's I have to say, it's like Darwinism, right? If we don't evolve, we become extinct, and we become irrelevant, and who wants to be irrelevant?
Michael, any thoughts on this? You work with? No, he's shaking his head. Right.
No. I can't improve on Leah. Leah, that was perfect.
All right. Representative Paulette has a question about the impacts of learning loss associated with the pandemic and distance learning. COVID-related cuts in advising, and what we may be doing or need to be doing to respond to that. And, my 2 kids are in the next room trying to somehow hang on to their 8th and 4th grade years respectively, but we all know it's not the same. I mean, we're, at least in my house, we're really honest about that. This is not normal, and they're, it is what it is. But thoughts on that?
I think this is a tough one. I go back to my lifelong learning example, right? Like we can't this is, as you said, Ben, I can't improve on it, right? This is not optimal, period, right? Learning loss is happening. But the reality is that we shouldn't be delivering kind of static learning, static credentials, right? Like, how do we build the infrastructure for lifelong learning so that people are continuing to learn, right? They're continuing to build. It is something that we build into our post-secondary education and training system, right? So I don't think we can think about just this moment and what we're losing. Like, what are we going to put in place to allow people to continuously improve their skills, right? Like, so I think that because what we're losing, you know, if we don't have the right strategy, like, right, those are gaps, and those are real challenges, right? Like the young people who are making different plans for post-secondary could get derailed for life, right? Like, so I do think that, like, how do we create the infrastructure to have them reconnect and continue, not just now, but throughout their working lives? I really think, so y'all probably remember, because we're all, you know, kind of, I won't say we're old, but I think we're all, you know, of age to remember the Spellings Commission, right? Like, in 2006 or something like that. One of the findings was lack of infrastructure for lifelong learning. That was 2006. It's 2020, right? We got to get with this program, you know?
I agree with Michael. I think he's right on this, but the right now, I think an institution needs to really look at who are your students, listen to those students of what they need at the moment. You know, if an institution is cutting advising, I think you said advising, and you have students that need that, what are you doing with your mission of educating those students?
Mm-hmm.
We've got to re-examine those sacred cows we all had before COVID and put those sacred cows to the side and deal with what we have right now at the moment, and take those individuals that are going to support you and move on. Because you're dealing with students' lives and learning at the moment, and then do what Michael is talking about and making sure that we continue to build.
And I would add to that too. I've been meeting with our regional superintendents, so for K-12, and every single one of them felt that concern about the quote unquote lost year and what that's going to mean for certainly elementary schools, kids moving through the system, if you will. So it's not just for us as higher ed folks thinking, oh gosh, junior and seniors, and are they going to be college ready? It's going to be through the pipeline, and what does that mean? So, you know, again, I'll bring it back to Ames at the community college. We're starting to think about, okay, what can we do to help? How can we partner with K-12 to maybe have some bridge programs, some summer institutes, something that's going to assist helping folks may not recapture the whole year, but certainly tighten up some of the skills that they may not have gotten that were necessary. And I have to say, it's not just the academic intellectual, it's the social development too. And so how can we figure out how to get them appropriately socially developed in a physically distanced, face-covered environment, and make sure that that's not lost either.
We've got a question from the event platform that I'll share, and I really like this one, and it may be where we end. The question is how we protect students from predatory entities posing as legitimate non-traditional alternatives, given that such entities fuel the prevailing mindset that non-traditional alternatives and credentials are lesser options. So thinking back on this sense that, you know, part of what's changing about higher education is likely the expansion of forms of credentials, some of which are likely high value, others which may not be. But how do we, it gets back to some of the earlier conversation, but in this case, how do we carefully distinguish and protect students from those that are really not, you know, that are predatory and not conferring value?
I think it's a great question. So Millie, you know, the commission has data on this, right? Like, they have data on the proprietaries, and there are some reasons for concern. We know that. But one of the things that I would encourage, you know, just to be heretical here, so why do low-income students and students of color flock to those institutions, right? Those institutions are doing something right with regard to the confidence that they give students as to what, education can do for them. We know that they don't always deliver, but there is something in their communication, in their approach to those students, in their, whether it's the scheduling. Professor Rosenbaum at Northwestern wrote a book that really showed, I'm forgetting the title, but it was about the proprietaries and how in some ways they had practices that we need to take, that traditional higher education needs to take a look at, right? So I think that, yes, we need to manage for bad actors, but they are also, I think, doing some things that are really responsive, particularly the speed, like students of color who are economically fragile, they're looking to get connected to work. And I think that the proprietary sometimes promise that. So there's just some lessons there, I believe, that we need to learn from.
I totally agree with Michael. I will say that being in New York, my first presidency was at a for-profit. I learned a lot. I would send out surveys. There were 7,000 students, and I would always ask, why are you spending money coming here and not going to CUNY community colleges and four-year institutions? They're treated with respect. They're helped along the way. You had to have an internship in the area in which you were studying paid, and they assisted you with support. I will say, Bill Tierney has a book, Not All For-Profits Are Bad. There are some good ones out there. We've got to learn the lessons and stop being so elitist and look at what they're doing right and bring that in, that when they walk in, from the moment you walk into that campus, that person in the front desk is treating you like you are gold and helping you through the process. Are our institutions doing that?
Well, thank you. I want to thank our panelists. I think we'll finish on that. From their level of engagement and insight, I think we can safely say there are at least 3 people in this country who were not clicking refresh constantly in their browsers for the last hour and 15 minutes. And so grateful for all of your time and engagement in the conversation, and to WICHE and WCET for hosting it and putting it on. So I think we're going to leave it at that. Megan, do you sort of take us out of here?
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, and I wish everybody some sanity today, and thank you all for being part of this conversation and giving us your time. So be well, everybody. Thank you so much.